Standing tall with a snowy peak soaring up 4,296 feet into the great clouds above, the second highest mountain in Scotland looms the formidable presence of the mountain known as Ben MacDhui. It is the second highest mountain in Scotland, and in its perpetually misty mountaintop, there is said to be something lurking there, just out of sight, shifting through the fog to mystify all those who see it. This is the Amphir Leamor, the legendary Big Grey Man of Scotland. The entity has been seen for centuries, with one of the first real detailed accounts coming from 1791, when a poet by the name of James Hogg found himself trudging through this foggy, almost dreamlike realm while tending his sheep. As he stared off into the murky fog-obscured distance, something came into view, preceded by a rumbling disturbance that spooked the sheep. He would say of the towering beast that stood before him, "It was a giant blackamoor, at least 30 feet high, and equally proportioned, and very near me. I was actually struck powerless with astonishment and terror." After returning the next day, the massive Goliath reappeared there in the fog, like some monolithic, impossible statue from another era or world, and this time, when Hogg removed his hat, the colossal thing before him did the same thing. He would come to the conclusion that the mysterious phenomena was merely his own shadow distorted through some atmospheric condition he could not possibly hope to understand. But this was certainly not the end of the legend of the Big Grey Man. It would be seen sporadically through the years wandering about the cold peaks, usually described as being at least 10 feet in height, often even larger, with long arms, an ape-like face, and covered with short gray fur. In stranger accounts, it's described as even wearing a long dark coat and top hat. Its presence is said to give a profound sense of unease and fear that almost seems to come in waves to those who see it, and strange music in its passing also is not uncommon. In 1904, there was a report from biologist Hugh Welsh, who had been up on the mountain collecting plant and animal samples along with his brother. Welsh would say that they often were aware of the heavy footsteps of enormous feet stomping about the outside of the periphery of their vision, although they were never able to see exactly what was making them. Strangely, these incidents were always accompanied by a tangible sense of dread and apprehension that hung in the air. A very well-known sighting occurred in 1891, when a mountaineer, highly respected professor of organic chemistry at University College London, and Fellow of the Royal Society, A.J. Norman Colley, was on the desolate mountain and had his own encounter with the mysterious entity, when he heard something enormous treading along behind him, as if it was following him through the mist, followed by an overwhelming and crippling wave of inexplicable fear that washed over him. Colley would sit on his strange experience for years before finally describing what he had seen at a speech in the 27th Annual General Meeting of the Cairngorm Club in 1925, during which he would explain, "I began to think I heard something else than merely the noise of my own footsteps. For every few steps I took, I heard a crunch, and then another crunch as if someone was walking after me, but taking steps 3 or 4 times the length of my own. I said to myself, this is all nonsense. I listened and heard it again, but could see nothing in the mist. As I walked on and on, the eerie crunch sounded behind me. I was seized with terror and took to my heels, staggering blindly among the boulders for 4 or 5 miles, nearly down to the Rothiemurchus forest. Whatever you make of it, I do not know, but there is something very queer about the top of Ben MacDhui, and I will not go back there again by myself, I know." Considering the high standing of this witness, the legend of the Big Grey Man was given a sort of infusion of new life with this report, and Colley was soon after contacted by another chemistry teacher by the name of Dr. A.M. Kellis, who had been emboldened to come forward with his own spooky report to relate. Kellis would say that he had been with his brother upon Ben MacDhui when they had seen a colossal grey figure over 10 feet in height stomping towards them from the cairn before seemingly vanishing into thin air, perhaps disappearing behind a rocky pass in the relentless fog. They were not immune to the blanket of fear the thing was said to cast, and were infused with such a panic that they ran far from there as fast as they could, the whole time convinced that the bizarre entity was pursuing them through the gloomy mist. Such sightings and encounters would continue on to later years as well. In 1939, the adventurer Alastair Borthwick would write a report of the creature in his book, Always a Little Further, in which he recounts an encounter with the mysterious beast involving two climber friends of his. The two climbers apparently had been out on the mountain when they had been plagued by the unshakable feeling that they were being followed by something immense out there in the mist beyond where their vision could reach. Borthwick would write of these tales. The first was alone, heading over MacDhui for Koror on a night when the snow had a hard, crisp crust through which his boots broke at every step. He reached the summit, and it was while he was descending the slopes which fall towards the Larg that he heard footsteps behind him. Footsteps not in the rhythm of his own, but occurring only once for every 3 steps he took. I felt a queer, crinkly feeling in the back of my neck, he told me, but I said to myself, this is silly, there must be a reason for it. So I stopped, and the footsteps stopped, and I sat down and tried to reason it out. I could see nothing. There was a moon about somewhere, but the mist was fairly thick. The only thing I could make of it was that when my boots broke through the snow crust, they made some sort of echo. But then every step should have echoed. It's not just this regular 1 in 3. I was scared stiff. I got up and walked on, trying hard not to look behind me. I got down all right. The footsteps stopped 1,000 feet above the Larg, and I didn't run. But if anything had so much as said boo behind me, I'd have been down to Koror like a streak of lightning. The second man's experience was roughly similar. He was on MacDhui and alone. He heard footsteps. He was climbing in daylight in summer, but so dense was the mist that he was working by compass, and visibility was almost as poor as it would have been at night. The footsteps he heard were made by something or someone trudging up the fine screes which decorate the upper parts of the mountain, a thing not so extraordinary in itself, though the steps were only a few yards behind him, but exceedingly odd when the mist suddenly cleared and he could see no living thing on the mountain, at that point devoid of cover of any kind. Did the footsteps follow yours exactly? I asked him. No, he said. That was the funny thing. They didn't. They were regular, all right, but the queer thing was that they seemed to come once for every 2.5 steps I took. He thought it queerer still when I told him the other man's story. You see, he was long-legged and 6 feet tall, and the first man was only 5'7". Once I was out with a search party on MacDhui, and on the way down after an unsuccessful day, I asked some of the gamekeepers and stalkers who were with us what they would think of it all. They worked on MacDhui, so they should know. Had they seen Furless Moor? Did he exist? Or was it just a silly story? They looked at me for a few seconds, and then one said, "We do not talk about that." In 1940, Scottish author R. MacDonald Robertson and a friend were camped up on the mountain when they allegedly were jolted awake by the incessant growls of barking of the dog they had brought along. As the men listened to the night, they said they could hear the approaching of thudding steps in the gravel, with each one bringing more of a panicked reaction from the dog, indeed within themselves, and fading away as they passed, and the dog gradually relaxed, as did they. There was also an account from 1942 of climber Sidney Scroggie, who saw there on the mountain a tall, stately human figure, appearing out of the blackness on one side of the loch, and clearly silhouetted against the water pace, with long, deliberate steps across the combined burns just where they enter the loch. No evidence of such footprints could ever be found. In 1945, there was also the experience of mountaineer Peter Densham, who claimed to have felt a thick dread approach from the fog, as well as the 1948 report of climber Richard Freer, who said that he had felt a presence utterly abstract but intensely real. Frere would find the courage to look out from his tent and see something massive, 20 feet in height and brownish in color, with an air of insolent strength, moving away off into the moonlight. Oddly, Frere would describe hearing some sort of ethereal, strange pipe music echoing throughout the air at the time of the sighting. In 1958, there was the account published in the Scots magazine by naturalist and adventurer Alexander Tunian, who had his own frightening and rather dramatic experience in 1943, of which he would write, "In October 1943, I spent a 10-day leave climbing alone in the Cairngorms. One afternoon, just as I reached the summit cairn of Ben MacDhui, mist swirled across the Lairg Grue and enveloped the mountain. The atmosphere became dark and oppressive. A fierce, bitter wind whisked among the boulders, and an odd sound echoed throughout the mist. A loud footstep, it seemed. then another and another. A strange shape loomed up, receded, came charging at me. Without hesitation, I whipped out the revolver and fired 3 times at the figure. When it still came on, I turned and hared down the path, reaching Glenderry in a time that I had never bettered. You may ask if it was really the Fir Lachmor. Frankly, I think it was. Such sightings would continue on into even more modern times. In the 1990s, we have the account of 3 witnesses who say they were hiking in the area when they came across a dark human-shaped figure that ran with incredible speed across the track in front of them, and which exuded a sense of terror and foreboding. When they approached the area where the thing had been, one of the witnesses apparently saw through the branches of the trees a face that looked human but not human. One of them gathered the courage to maybe foolishly fling a stone its way, and it retreated into the wilderness. The beast would later chase their car, managing to keep up with the vehicle up to 45 miles an hour before tiring and giving up. There was also an account from 2004 when Scottish ghost hunter Tom Robertson was in the area when he and his companion saw a 10-foot-tall figure next to their tent. It apparently reached a hand over the tent to send it collapsing, and they describe what they say looked like a big gray gorilla standing there in the moonlight. The creature left, and the pair got out of there as fast as they could, finding large footprints left behind as they did. In 2005, a witness named Peter George would have his own encounter, saying, "Out of the corner of my eye, over to the left towards the stream, I caught a glimpse of a tall gray figure. At first, I thought it was one of our party, although all of them were inside the bothy. Turned to look properly and couldn't see anyone." Continuing on to 2006 in June, a witness named Stephen Pedler was with his father Roy when they heard anomalous footsteps behind them as if stalking them. In that same year, in September, there was another anonymous witness. It seems remarkable that such an entity could exist up in the mountains of Scotland, of all places, and it had certainly generated its share of theories on what people could be experiencing. In addition to the ideas that it could all just be hallucinations, illusions, or the mind otherwise playing tricks on the witnesses, a prominent theory is that these sightings are the result of an atmospheric phenomenon typically referred to as a broken specter. In this case, when the sun is at a particular angle, it can interact with clouds or mists to magnify a shadow, producing a very realistic-looking construct that typically takes the form of a giant figure. Still, others insist that this is indicative of some extremely large, Bigfoot-like creature lurking about. But this seems odd considering Scotland is an unlikely candidate for a habitat for such a creature. Considering the sense of fear that envelops those who encounter it, and its overall ghostly appearance in general, maybe the big gray man is something else altogether. Who knows? For now, Big Grey Scotland remains an impenetrable mystery, as it always has been, and perhaps always will be. Thus concludes Season 1 of The Unknown Files here on Unknown Territory. If you like what you heard, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. And join us on June 5th for the start of Season 2 here on Unknown Territory.